Buried in sealed archives and scattered diaries lies a war few dared to remember. Behind every whispered order and coded transmission was a truth darker than any battlefield, a world of shadows, silence, and sacrifice. What happens when the lines between heroism and horror blur, and history forgets the names that changed it all? The corridors of Bletchley Park hummed with a click-clack of typewriters, the rustle of papers, and the faint murmurs of logic whispered in Morse and mathematics. Officially, it was the government code and cipher school. Unofficially, it was the most secretive nerve center of British intelligence during World War II. The public knew of Alan Turing and the bomb machine, but few knew the name Lena Bauer. Born in Danzig in 1917 to a Polish father and German mother, Lena grew up in a house steeped in languages and tension. Her childhood was spent navigating the divide between two identities, Polish defiance and German pride. By the time she was 18, she spoke 5 languages fluently, including Russian. Her father, a schoolteacher with socialist leanings, vanished during one of the early Nazi purges in 1933. Lena never saw him again. Her mother, a devout Catholic, quietly rebelled by teaching Lena not just scripture, but codes, secret alphabets, riddles, puzzles. It was a game to them until war turned it into survival. By 1939, Lena was working as a typist in a German telegraph office near Königsberg. But Lena listened as much as she typed. She noted how certain phrases repeated, how locations correlated with code words. One day, she intercepted a message clearly marked, for WWII only. It was a mistake. That message, containing details of planned arrests in Gdynia, included the name of her childhood friend, a Jewish girl named Maya. Lena slipped the paper into her shoe, cycled through the cold night to Maya's apartment, and warned her. Within a week, Lena was gone. Through contacts linked to the Polish underground and a forged passport, Lena crossed into Lithuania, then Sweden, and eventually reached Britain by fishing boat in early 1940. She was 23, soaked in sea salt, shaking from cold, and carrying a head full of Nazi ciphers. Her British handlers were skeptical. She was foreign, young, and female, but she had memorized entire codebooks. She was taken to an MI6 station for debriefing. 3 weeks later, she was at Bletchley. At Hut 6, where German Army and Air Force codes were processed, Lena was a ghost. She was officially listed as linguistic assistant to avoid drawing attention, but her real task was pattern isolation, detecting code anomalies across transmissions from the Eastern Front and Kriegsmarine outposts. She quickly developed a reputation for her uncanny ability to feel irregularities, often identifying time shifts and location mismatches others missed. Her breakthrough came during what was supposed to be a routine intercept, traffic from a U-boat flotilla west of Ireland. Lena noticed inconsistencies in the depth and weather codes. She dug into previous transmissions and realized that a small group of U-boats was operating under false identities, likely planning to trap a northbound convoy using faked distress calls. The British rerouted convoy HX-112 in March 1941, avoiding a disaster that could have killed over 2,000 sailors. No one in the press knew why the convoy changed course. They called it good luck. It was Lena. She spent most days hunched over signal logs, surrounded by ashtrays and pots of cold tea. Her hair, once long and braided, was cut short to keep it from falling into her eyes. She barely spoke, except to correct a cipher or offer a rare dry joke. Colleagues respected her brilliance but whispered about her past. A few suspected she was a spy. But one person believed in her, Peter Caldwell, a mathematician from Oxford who eventually became her closest confidant. Their friendship was rooted in silence. He read Polish for her. She taught him how to pick a lock with a hairpin. Together, they broke the code names of several WWII agents in France, passing the intel to SOE operatives in occupied territories. In late 1943, Lena discovered a string of phrases in weather reports transmitted to North Africa. The code was new, complex, erratic, filled with misdirection. But to Lena, it was familiar. It was the style of a man she once typed for in Königsberg, an SS officer named Roshan, who had a habit of ending messages with quotes from Goethe. She found the patterns, cracked the cipher, and discovered plans for German sabotage of oil supplies in Tunisia. Operation Torch proceeded without German interference. No one mentioned Lena's name. As the war neared its end, Lena requested a transfer. She wanted to join the interrogation unit at Trent Park, hoping to speak to captured German officers. Her request was denied. Too valuable, they said. She remained at Bletchley until VE Day. When the war ended, she received no public recognition. Her work, like that of so many others, remained classified. She was offered a role in post-war intelligence, but she declined. Lena disappeared from the official record. She moved to Glasgow under a new identity and taught mathematics at a girls' school. She never spoke of her work. Not even when interviewed decades later for a BBC documentary on Bletchley Park did she agree to go on camera. Only after her death in 1996 did her diaries surface. Inside the notebooks, hidden behind teaching notes and algebra lessons, were coded entries, an encrypted memoir of her war. It took historians nearly 5 years to fully decode. When they did, they found not just operational data, but raw emotion. Her guilt over intercepted messages she couldn't translate in time. Her dreams haunted by the tapping of typewriter keys. Her heartbreak over Peter Caldwell, who died in a V-2 rocket strike in 1944. Lena Bauer never sought recognition. She left behind no medals, no headlines, no photographs. But her quiet mind helped shorten a brutal war. She outwitted men who thought themselves invincible. She saved lives, deciphered death, and lived in the shadow of silence. The war was fought by generals and soldiers, but won by people like Lena, hidden behind locked doors, buried in code, whispering secrets into the machines of history. In the mountain forests of Yugoslavia, the snow muffled gunfire and turned blood into silence. These were not battlefields marked on Allied maps, but landscapes of shadows, ambushes, betrayals, and unsung resistance. Among the partisans who fought the Nazis from 1941 to the war's bitter end was a man who came to embody both freedom and futility, Milan Kovac. Born in a village near Sarajevo in 1910, Milan grew up in a world fractured by empire and ideology. His father had served in the Austro-Hungarian army during the Great War. His mother, a Bosnian Serb, recited folk poems of Ottoman resistance. Milan became a schoolteacher, quiet and reserved, known for quoting Voltaire in Serbo-Croatian and riding a rusted bicycle between villages with a sack of chalk. But when Hitler's forces invaded Yugoslavia in April 1941 and partitioned the country among Axis powers and puppet states, the time for chalk and classrooms ended. The Nazis installed a fascist regime in Croatia, the Ustase, infamous for their brutality against Serbs, Jews, and Roma. Milan watched his childhood friend, a Catholic priest who had once debated Marxism with him over plum brandy, become a collaborator. When students disappeared, he joined the resistance. Initially, Milan's work was minor, smuggling radios, copying propaganda leaflets, delivering medicine to mountain camps. But he was drawn into the ranks of the communist-led Yugoslav partisans under Josip Broz Tito, the most effective resistance movement in all of occupied Europe. By 1943, Milan had command of a battalion of fighters, farmers, former soldiers, and women who had lost their husbands. They called him Usitolj, the teacher. The fighting was vicious and personal. Milan's battalion operated in the Dinaric Alps, launching hit-and-run attacks on German supply lines and ambushing Italian convoys. In the village of Kamesnica, they liberated a POW camp holding Soviet and British airmen. Milan was wounded in the thigh by machine gun fire, but refused evacuation. He walked with a limp from then on, his right boot always darker from the blood that never washed out. By late 1944, as the Red Army advanced into the Balkans, the partisans gained recognition from the Allies. Supplies were airdropped, and British SOE operatives parachuted into the forests to provide weapons and training. One of them, a Captain Edward Ned Harrow, formed a close bond with Milan. Their letters, later found in a rusted ammunition box, revealed a deep mutual respect. Ned once wrote, "You command not by fear or ideology, but because you understand grief better than most. That is your weapon." After Germany's defeat in May 1945, Yugoslavia emerged from occupation bloodied and divided. The monarchy was abolished, and Tito established a communist federation, refusing to align completely with either the Soviet Union or the West. Milan, who had fought for freedom, began to suspect that what replaced fascism might only be a different kind of tyranny. In 1946, he was offered a role in the new government as Minister of Education. He declined. "I fought for schools, not slogans," he reportedly told the Messenger. That winter, Milan's name was quietly removed from official lists of decorated partisans. His refusal to join the party had made him suspect. Then came the purges. As Tito consolidated power, dissenters were arrested. Former partisans who resisted centralization were labeled enemies of the state. Milan was warned by an old comrade who now worked in the Interior Ministry, "Leave or be silenced." But Milan had no stomach for exile. Instead, he returned to the forests of the Dinaric Alps, not to fight, but to disappear. For 2 decades, Milan lived as a ghost. Some said he was in Albania, others in a monastery near Montenegro. But in truth, he lived in a remote shepherd's hut with a few goats, a rifle, and a typewriter. He wrote letters he never sent and watched the world fracture into the Cold War. Yugoslavia stayed nominally independent, but its people bore the weight of invisible chains. Villagers sometimes brought him news, a bottle of rakicha, or scraps of paper from his old students. One of them wrote, "You taught me to read. The party teaches me to forget." It wasn't until 1968, when political unrest swept across Eastern Europe, that Milan emerged from hiding. He traveled to Belgrade under a false name and left a manuscript at a university archive, *Skys Slobod *, Sketches of Freedom, a collection of essays and war recollections written in allegory. It was ignored, misfiled, and forgotten until 1993. Milan died the following winter, alone, during a blizzard that collapsed the roof of his hut. He was found by a boy searching for lost sheep. In his coat pocket was a folded photograph of his partisan unit, all faces marked with black ink. On the back, a quote in Latin, "Ubi libertas, ibi patria," "Where there is freedom, there is my homeland." Decades later, as Yugoslavia dissolved into brutal ethnic wars, Milan's story resurfaced. His manuscript was published posthumously and became a cult text among dissidents and poets. A small bronze plaque was placed on the ruins of his hut, engraved simply, "Untold. He taught us not to kneel." To the world, World War II ended in 1945. But for Milan Kovac and countless others like him, the war never truly ended. It changed uniforms, names, flags. He had fought for a homeland where no one feared their neighbor. In the end, he chose exile over compromise, silence over corruption, memory over ideology. The forest remembers him still. In spring, when the snow melts and the wildflowers bloom, shepherds say you can hear the sound of a typewriter echoing faintly among the pines. The first thing Elizabeth Mahler remembered was the heat, not the kind that warmed, but the kind that devoured. It came in waves, crashing down the narrow alleyways of Dresden, carrying with it the scent of scorched flesh, burning books, and shattered porcelain. It was February 13, 1945, and the sky was falling. Elizabeth had been a nurse at Johannstadt Hospital since 1938, long before the war made her trade in bandages for morphine and splints for battlefield trauma. She had seen broken bones, infected wounds, and shrapnel embedded in the flesh of children. But nothing had prepared her for that night. Dresden was known as the Florence on the Elbe, a city of spires, museums, and opera. Despite the war, it had remained largely untouched, seen by many as a cultural sanctuary rather than a military target. The locals believed its beauty would spare it from destruction. Some even joked that the Allies were art lovers at heart. Elizabeth knew better. The hospital had received quiet warnings of a possible evacuation. But where would they go? The trains were full of wounded soldiers, displaced families, and Jews hidden beneath false identities. On the night of February 13th, the sirens wailed just after 9 p.m. Elizabeth was in the children's ward, tending to a girl with pneumonia. The girl clutched a wooden doll whose painted smile had faded from too many boilings. When the lights flickered, Elizabeth wrapped the child in a blanket and carried her downstairs into the reinforced cellar. The first wave of bombers struck just before 10 p.m. The ground shook like thunder underfoot. The ceiling above groaned as if the sky itself were cracking open. Elizabeth counted between blasts, trying to gauge how close each explosion was. The hospital, miraculously, withstood the first wave. But the fires began almost immediately. By midnight, the second wave had arrived. This time, the bombs were incendiaries, designed not just to explode, but to burn. The fires spread faster than anyone imagined possible, whipped into frenzy by gale force winds created by the firestorm itself. People were incinerated where they stood. Others, desperate for air, fled into cellars only to suffocate as the oxygen was sucked away. The streets became rivers of flame. Elizabeth surfaced just after 2 a.m. to help evacuate the upper floors. The hospital's east wing was gone, reduced to rubble. She moved through smoke like a phantom, dragging gurneys, lifting the unconscious, shouting through a world of screams. Her uniform was singed, her eyes bloodshot, her hands blistered. Somewhere in the madness, she lost track of the little girl and the doll. In the following days, Elizabeth saw things that would never leave her. Piles of bodies, fused together by heat. Shadows burned into brick walls. Survivors stumbling barefoot over glass and cinders, their hair burned away, their skin like paper. She worked around the clock, driven not by duty but by the inertia of horror. Rest was impossible. Sleep brought nightmares of children on fire. When Allied planes returned in daylight to finish the destruction, Elizabeth watched from a shattered window as the Baroque skyline collapsed into ash. The Zwinger Palace, the Frauenkirche, the Semper Opera, all gone. The bombers flew low, unchallenged. The Luftwaffe had long since vanished. What made it worse was the silence afterward. The city had no voice. There were no radios, no newspapers, no announcements from Berlin. Only smoke and the rustling of survivors moving like ghosts through the ruins, whispering, "Warm." Why? Official Nazi statements framed the attack as proof of Allied barbarism, but no one truly listened anymore. The people were broken. And yet, even in that desolation, Elizabeth kept working. She sterilized surgical tools over candles. She trained orphaned teenagers to bandage wounds. She traded bread for gauze with passing soldiers. Once, she found an American airman hiding in the shell of a museum, wounded and terrified. She didn't report him. She gave him water and wrapped his ankle before sending him into the countryside. In April, when Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Dresden, Elizabeth was still in the hospital. What was left of it? The soldiers treated her with wary respect. One offered her chocolate. Another pointed to the ruins and muttered, "Stalingrad." She nodded. There were no victors in rubble. After the war, Elizabeth testified briefly during a local tribunal convened by occupying Soviet officials. She spoke not about tactics or politics, but about the smell of burning skin and the silence of children who no longer cried. The interpreter paused at one moment, clearly shaken. The official transcript omitted most of her testimony. She remained in Dresden during the reconstruction, refusing offers to relocate. She said her place was among the ruins, among the people who couldn't leave. In 1952, she helped establish a new clinic in Neustadt, built from stone salvaged from bombed-out buildings. She never married. She rarely spoke of the war except in whispers to former patients who came back to thank her, though some couldn't meet her eyes. Too many memories. In 1963, an American journalist researching civilian casualties interviewed her. She agreed to speak on one condition: no names, no politics. "I don't want my grief used as someone else's victory," she said. The article was never published. When Elizabeth died in 1987, the city was still divided by walls, not of brick, but of history. West and East. Victim and victor. Memory and myth. At her funeral, an old man left a small wooden doll on her coffin. It had one arm missing. No one knew who he was. Today, a plaque outside the rebuilt Johannstadt Hospital bears her name, one of many. Most visitors walk past it without reading. But for those who do, the inscription is simple. She healed what others destroyed. In the bitter waters north of Murmansk, where the sea stung like knives and the sun vanished for months, a fleet moved in silence. Few knew their names, fewer still remembered their missions. They were the Soviet submariners of the Arctic convoys, men like Captain Nikolai Petrov, whose war was fought beneath ice and isolation, shadowed by the creak of steel and the echo of depth charges. Petrov was born in Vladivostok in 1909, the son of a fisherman who disappeared during the Red Terror. Raised by his aunt, he joined the Soviet Navy at 17, drawn not by patriotism but by the promise of food and structure. He trained in Leningrad, where he excelled at mathematics and engineering, quickly earning a place in the submarine fleet. When war broke out in 1941, he was 32 and already a veteran officer. His vessel, S-31, was docked at Polyarny, near the Barents Sea, when the first Arctic convoys began. Operation Dervish. PQ-1. PQ-17. Western names for desperate missions, cargo ships loaded with tanks, ammunition, and tin-stamped food cans, all bound for Soviet ports to fuel the Eastern Front. The convoys were easy targets, crawling through icy waters under the watchful eyes of German reconnaissance planes and hunted by U-boats and the dreaded battleship Tirpitz. The British and Americans provided escort destroyers, but the Soviet Navy added its own defense, submarines like Petrov's, positioned in wolf-like packs along the convoy routes, tasked with intercepting enemy ships and drawing away German subs. It was suicide disguised as strategy. The interior of S-31 was a metallic womb, cramped, humid, reeking of oil, sweat, and boiled potatoes. The crew of 48 slept in rotating shifts, often sharing bunks still warm from the previous occupant. Silence was law beneath the waves. Even coughs were stifled behind cloth to avoid detection by German sonar. Petrov kept a notebook, illegal, of course. In it, he recorded technical notes, personal observations, and fragments of poetry. "This war," he wrote in January 1942, "is fought in the dark. Our glory is measured in rust and frostbite." In March of that year, S-31 was ordered to intercept a reported German supply vessel near Bear Island. The waters were choked with drifting ice, visibility near zero. For 2 days, they waited submerged, oxygen running low. When the periscope finally spotted a silhouette, it was not a cargo ship, but a Kriegsmarine escort destroyer. Petrov faced a choice: retreat into deeper waters and risk hull-crushing pressure, or surface and run for the ice shelf. He did neither. Instead, he held position, engines silent, drifting with the current. The destroyer passed overhead, sonar pinging, dropping depth charges that shook the rivets from the bulkheads. The crew said nothing. Petrov scratched 3 words into his notebook. "Hold. Don't breathe." The ship moved on. S-31 survived. But 3 crewmen later died from carbon monoxide poisoning. There hadn't been enough air. 4 months, their missions continued. They never docked in Allied ports, never received medals from Churchill or Roosevelt. When British sailors visited Murmansk, they toasted vodka with Red Fleet officers but rarely saw the submariners, who were quarantined for operational security. The Western press didn't know their names. The Soviet press never published them. In 1943, during the perilous PQ-18 convoy, S-31 encountered a German U-boat stalking the rear flank. Petrov ordered a high-risk surface maneuver, breaching the ice to launch torpedoes. The gamble paid off. The U-boat was struck amidships and sank in flames. But the blast alerted a nearby German patrol boat, which responded with depth charges. S-31 was damaged and barely made it back to port. When Petrov returned to Polyarny, he received no commendation. Instead, he was interrogated by NKVD officers who questioned why the submarine had surfaced without orders. He was accused of improvisational recklessness and demoted temporarily. His torpedo officer, Lieutenant Kirov, disappeared the following week. Petrov never spoke of it again. By war's end, S-31 had completed 22 missions. Petrov's health had deteriorated. He suffered from nerve damage in his hands and ulcers from stress and starvation. He He was offered a desk position in Leningrad. He refused. He served 2 more years on a training vessel before retiring quietly in 1948. He never married. He returned to Vladivostok and worked as a physics teacher. His students knew him as strict but fair, always smelling faintly of oil and salt. He never discussed the war. It wasn't until 1971, when a local historian researching Arctic naval operations visited him, that Petrov reluctantly shared fragments of his story. "There are no statues for those who freeze in silence," he said. "We were ballast, useful until replaced." His notebooks were donated to the Naval Archives posthumously. In them were meticulous diagrams of submarine schematics, descriptions of polar sea currents, and poems written in the margins. One read, "In steel we sailed, unseen, unheard, through seas where even birds deferred. We knew not cheers nor glory's flame, just ocean, silence, duty, name." Captain Nikolai Petrov died in 1983. No obituary marked his passing. But in 2005, a declassified Allied intelligence report acknowledged the role of Soviet submarines in diverting German naval resources from the convoys, contributions once minimized in Western accounts. A plaque now rests in a naval museum in Murmansk, bearing the names of lost Soviet submariners. Among them, S-31, Captain N. Petrov. Their war was not filmed, not glamorized. But in the frozen deep, they held a line no map ever marked, and history, slow and reluctant, finally remembered. In the hills of eastern Tennessee, hidden behind barbed wire and government signs that warned, "Keep out, war work," a city was born from nothing. It was called Oak Ridge, but to the women who worked there, it was simply the site. Among them was Dr. Evelyn Harper, a brilliant but under-recognized physicist who would later say, "We built the future before we knew what it was." Evelyn was born in 1915 in Milwaukee, the daughter of a school librarian and a machinist. She excelled in math, studied physics at the University of Chicago, and was one of the first women in her department to earn a doctorate. Her dissertation focused on atomic mass ratios, an obscure topic at the time, but one that would later make her invaluable to a project few could have imagined. In 1943, Evelyn was approached by a recruiter from the Office of Scientific Research and Development. She wasn't told what the job was, only that it was patriotic and urgent. She accepted without hesitation, boarding a train to a location not marked on any map. When she arrived at Oak Ridge, she was stunned to find an entire town built around secrecy. Dormitories, mess halls, grocery stores, even a bowling alley, all fenced off from the rest of the world. She was assigned to the Y-12 plant, where electromagnetic separation was being used to isolate uranium-235. The work was physically demanding and mentally exhausting. Her job was to calibrate the calatrons, massive machines adapted from Ernest Lawrence's cyclotron design, to optimize the separation process. The machines overheated frequently, tripped breakers, and emitted bursts of radiation that workers only vaguely understood. Dosimeter badges turned dark, then were replaced without explanation. Many of Evelyn's co-workers were young women from across the Midwest and South. Farm girls and factory hands told they were helping the war effort. Most didn't know they were enriching uranium. They were trained to monitor dials and keep readings steady, rewarded for consistency without understanding the purpose. Evelyn knew more. She had seen the equations, the particle charts, the letters from Oppenheimer himself. But even she didn't fully grasp what the end product would be until months later. She wrote in a private journal, "They tell us it's vital, that it will end the war. But we're building something that bends nature. And nature does not like to be bent." In the summer of 1944, Evelyn collapsed during a night shift. Nosebleeds, fatigue, nausea. She was taken to the small on-site clinic, given vitamin supplements, and told to rest. Radiation sickness wasn't diagnosed then, not officially. Whispers passed between lab techs and nurses, but no one dared speak openly. Careers and lives depended on silence. Despite her condition, Evelyn returned to work. She felt a sense of obligation, a fear that if she stopped, someone less careful might make a mistake. The machinery was delicate, the stakes unimaginable. By early 1945, rumors of a gadget being built in Los Alamos began to trickle through unofficial channels. Evelyn finally realized what they were making wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense, it was annihilation. When Hiroshima was bombed on August 6, 1945, the people of Oak Ridge learned, at last, what their efforts had produced. The town erupted in celebration, parades, dancing, tears of relief. But Evelyn stood in her dormitory window, watching the lights in the valley below. She thought of the electrons she had coaxed from metal, the isotope ratios she had fine-tuned. And she thought of a city of civilians turned to ash in seconds. Later that week, a reporter from Life magazine visited Oak Ridge. Evelyn refused an interview. When asked why, she said, "Let the men take the credit. They will, anyway." Her name never appeared in the official press. When the government declassified parts of the Manhattan Project, the contributions of women were mostly reduced to a few photographs and footnotes. After the war, Evelyn was offered a position at a prestigious research institute. She declined. Her lungs had been damaged, her health declined steadily. She returned to Milwaukee and taught high school physics. Her students remembered her as brilliant, impatient, and fiercely protective of girls who showed aptitude in science. She encouraged them to question everything, even the textbook. In 1959, she was invited to testify at a Senate hearing on nuclear fallout. She submitted a written statement instead, detailing her experience at Oak Ridge and warning of long-term contamination. Her words were filed, acknowledged, and ignored. She died in 1967 of leukemia. Her medical records, like many who worked on the Manhattan Project, were incomplete. Some of her letters were later recovered by her niece, who donated them to a women's history archive. One letter, dated September 1945, read, "We built a machine to split the world. No matter how noble our intentions, no matter how justified the cause, we must never forget that the minds who solved those equations were also mothers, sisters, daughters. We carried more than science into the future. We carried conscience." Today, a small plaque outside the rebuilt WWII facility bears no names, only a single inscription: "To those who worked in silence and lived in shadow." Dr. Evelyn Harper's story is one of many, part of a generation of women who made the atomic age possible. Not with speeches or medals, but with data, sweat, and quiet brilliance. Rosie may have riveted, but Evelyn split atoms and history. Long after the bombs stopped falling and the flags were lowered, the secrets remained, etched in classified files, whispered through ruined cities, hidden behind false smiles. Some survived. Most vanished. And the world moved on, never knowing who truly held the weight of its salvation or its damnation.